Hey guys, so it's Kenny here. I thought we could go ahead and talk a little bit today about some sustainable solutions for food production. We've talked about the downsides and parts that we need to work on, and we've hinted at some of these as we went along. We talked about locally grown food being benefit, but maybe not as beneficial as we originally thought. We started looking at optimal growth conditions and how do we go ahead and get produced all of the different varieties of food that we seem to enjoy, or do we limit ourselves to kind of eating uh, more of what's grown in our area? Lastly, we kind of talked about the fact that when it comes to meat, less meat is just better for the environment. And especially when we start looking at the impact of beef in particular, it can have a pretty negative impact on our planet. So today we want to kind of focus on some ideas around how can we be more sustainable with our food production process and the choices that you and I make, because as we've seen, that can be our biggest contribution to things ranging from climate change and greenhouse gases down to diversity and those agroecology concepts that we've been discussing. So let's take a look at our essential questions. Number one, what methods can be used for soil conservation? If we're going to have healthy plants, we got to start at the soil. Number two, what are the causes of desertification and salinization? Two key vocabulary words we'll go ahead and introduce today. Number three, what are sustainable practices for meat and seafood production? Number four, what are the components of a sustainable farm? And number five, what strategies exist for a move to sustainability in the next 50 years? So past human innovation has led to higher yield food production methods and supported a human population explosion. Remember our population dynamics? Problem is now we're growing so fast, having so much need, and the food that we do produce, we actually make a fair amount of waste, and it's causing all these other environmental impacts. Now, people are increasingly looking for practices that avoid or minimize the environmental impacts of food production so that it can be sustained over the long run. These practices include soil conservation, nutrient cycling, reducing the amount of salinization and desertification, genetic modification, and aquaculture. Let's start by taking a look at soil conservation. Now, soil conservation involves using a variety of methods to reduce topsoil erosion and restore soil fertility. You guys may have read about the Dust Bowl era in your social studies classes. And when we start looking at that, those farming practices really were a big cause as to why what happened. And so we need to make sure that that type of event doesn't occur again and that we are able to go ahead and restore some of the soil fertility, especially in those high producing areas of the United States, to get healthy soil, healthy crops, healthy food. So the methods we're going to take a look at include terrace farming, something like this. You may have seen a lot of this in South America because they do a lot of this. It goes back to the Incas. Alley cropping, where you see these kind of rows which come in so they can help reduce soil erosion. And this actually, depending on the size of the rows, can go ahead and allow for other species. If you do raise cattle, sheep, to go ahead and forage in between. It may allow you to go ahead and have chickens work in between. But you have tree breaks and stuff to catch any lost soil so you don't lose any of your topsoil. And then agroforestry, which ties in a lot to what we talked about in terms of agroecology. This just means things grow a little bit more wild, maybe not quite as neat in terms of how you look at it, but you're using nature to help support its plants. So the plants are helping each other. Certain things planted with certain other things actually help provide certain bacteria that can help with soil nitrogen fixation, make your soil healthier, can attract certain pollinators or insects. And we'll talk kind of more about these as we get there. So let's start by taking a look at terrace farming. Now, this is an example of a rice farm in Bali, Indonesia. Each level on this terrace retains water for crops and reduces topsoil erosion by controlling runoff. So if you have a slope, obviously water is going to want to run downhill. And so by removing that slope and making these cuts to make it nice and flat, the water doesn't run downhill and instead it stays on those little steps or levels. that provides water for the plants that are growing there, as well as not taking the soil downhill to the bottom. Okay. You can see similar things in terms of crop rotations and crop growth. You think about the growth of potatoes in South America. Okay. Different potatoes get planted at different levels, different elevations, different light exposures, because the people of the Andes in particular are very good at knowing what potato grows best where. And so, again, this is a great example of them working with nature instead of against nature. They're not trying to force the potato they want to a particular place. They grow different types. That's that diversity feature again. Different types of potatoes in different, you know, environments, different elevations, different sun exposures, etc., so that they get the best yield from their potatoes and they go ahead and work with nature in those. Then, if something happens to one of their potatoes, they still have all these other different types of potatoes to utilize. Okay. Let's take a look at agroforestry. Now, agroforestry is a unique land management approach that intentionally blends agriculture and forestry to enhance productivity, profitability, and environmental stewardship. This is a growing trend, and I think if you're interested in more of this, you can go ahead and look it up online. But essentially, what you end up seeing is you have pasture lands that are set with, they have like a little alley. You've got your rows of trees that are going to separate your different types of crops. All the different exposure levels are going to be planted so that you get different levels. And, you get your taller plants, your mid-level plants, your lower level plants, and they're all getting enough sun to go ahead and germinate. Okay. So the understory, the overstory, and the midstory are all going to be producing. In this particular example here, you're looking at nut-producing trees in the overstory, medicinal herbs down below, along with fruit-producing shrubs, ferns, and log-grown mushrooms. So they're getting high productivity by working with nature instead of against it. But if we don't follow these practices, if we start using more traditional industrialized agriculture, it requires a lot more inputs in terms of the pesticides and fertilizers, and this can sometimes lead to soil pollution. Industrial pollution often affects agriculture. Some of the chemicals emitted into the atmosphere or water supply ends up in the soil. So this ties back to what Rachel Carson was talking about in Silent Spring when they were worried about the DDT dust that was falling. The use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides can also contribute to this. It's estimated that about 19% of China's farmable land is contaminated, and 2.5% of it is too contaminated to grow food safely. So you're going to get lower yields, you're going to get lower quality food, and in some cases, it just becomes unhealthy to the point where it's damaging not only to the environment, but also to the people that are trying to consume food that comes from that area. When we start looking at plants, and I used to teach botany, there are three primary nutrients that we tend to go ahead and look for in healthy soil. These are the most important ones for plant nutrients, or what we call macronutrients, because they're needed for plant success. Those are N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And we need to make sure that all soils have this if we're going to effectively grow any food for our own consumption. But in order to keep those nutrient levels at places, at levels to which they can provide us with the food that we need to be able to replenish those nutrients. This is done more sustainably by including the use of the following. One, animal manures. Animal wastes tend to be very good in terms of replenishing things like nitrogen in particular. Green manure. Now, green manure is not the same thing you're thinking of. Plants don't produce waste products the same way, but we grow a crop in terms of things like rotation cropping that we will then till back into the soil after it's grown to replenish those nutrients into the soil by letting it decompose. And so crop rotation can use animal manure, can use green manure to go ahead and produce a soil that continues to stay rich in nutrients, especially the NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, that are going to make it beneficial. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at crop rotation. You may have heard of it before, but we want to make sure that you're familiar with it. And I have a little video to go over this so you better understand it.
Hi, my name is Marcus Meisler, and I have a question about agriculture. Now, I know that improving the environment is on everybody's minds these days, and I've actually read that crop rotation is one approach to support sustainability when it comes to farming. But I just don't know what those words mean to the farmer or to me as a consumer.
Let's give you a little information that just might clear up those definition difficulties. When we talk about rotating crops, we're not talking about circular cornfields or those big irrigation arms that move in a circle to water crops across parts of the heartland. Crop rotation really has to do with planting different crops in the same field from year to year as a way to improve soil conditions and reduce the need for artificial fertilizers. How does it work? Well, way back in time, farmers discovered that if you keep planting the same crop year after year, you use up the nutrients in that soil and you get disappointing harvests. But plant a different crop and you can replenish the field by adding new nitrogen to the soil. Crop rotation can also improve soil structure and fertility by alternating deep-rooted with shallow-rooted plants. So what's rotated? Well, soybeans and corn are big players in the rotation game, along with beans adding nutrients to the soil and improving yields. But lots of other plant choices come into play. Think about rye, oats, and barley, even clover, depending on the soil, the climate, and how much rain a farmer can expect to get. Which brings us to the other word you asked about. All of this works to improve the soil, making it possible to sustain the land and get a better harvest year after year.
Okay, so crop rotation can help keep the soil healthy and well structured to go ahead and allow for the development of good crops that we can go ahead and produce from it. This picture I always found to be pretty cool. Photographer Peter Essex walked among the chickens that fertilize the soil on this Pennsylvania farm. Mobile chicken coops are moved daily to distribute the manure more evenly and reduce runoff of fertilizer. So I thought this was such a cool little way to go ahead and still fertilize your field while producing some pretty free-range chickens. Okay, so again, diversifying. This is a great example of the agroecology concepts that we were talking about. And they're using this fertilizer in a way where they go ahead and take the mobile chicken coops and place them in another part of the field, which gives new food for the chickens, as well as whatever droppings they produce, providing fertilization that's nice and evenly spread out across their crops. So it's pretty cool. Now, while I say that, I also want to go ahead and highlight that not all free range is the same. According to the USDA, a producer must demonstrate the agency that the poultry has been allowed to access the outside. That's it, access the outside. This can mean one of two things. They're outside all the time, right? Except for at night when they need to be protected from predators. Or they could be in a huge coop with a single door that leads outside where chickens may or may not actually go outside at any point in time. So I love this ingenious idea that you have here of moving the chicken coop to these different environments with definite opportunity for chickens to go outside and scratch and go ahead and feed in this environment. So I thought this was pretty cool. Now, if we think back again to industrialized agriculture, one of the other things that we worry about is water use and leaving behind trace minerals, things like salt. So the next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is desertification. Now, some farming practices combined with drought and climate change can cause desertification. In this process, the productive potential of topsoils falls by 10% or more because of human activities such as overgrazing, right? So putting too many cattle, sheep, whatever it may be on the land. Deforestation, we cut down the forest so that we can have more room for grazing or planting crops. And excessive plowing, overuse of a field to the point where it's no longer productive in terms of its plant base or nutrient cycling. In extreme cases, it can lead to the creation of deserts, which is especially problematic in the world's water-short dry lands, which is home to about 2 billion people. In this particular example that you see here in the picture, This is an example of desertification caused by overgrazing. So cattle have come through these areas, stripped off most of the low growing vegetation, and that has led to the point where the land could no longer hold on to the water in an effective way, and it washed away a lot of the soils, leading to the deforestation or desertification. Now, depending on how that water goes through and what's in that water, you can also see a buildup of salts in the topsoil due to irrigation. In dry climates called soil salinization, which really lowers the productivity of the soil. Soil salinization stunts crop growth, lowers crop yields, and can eventually kill plants and ruin the land, making it unusable for years to come in the future without major overhauls in terms of restructuring the soil for use for other crops. So what can we do in these instances to try and make sure that we're not seeing salinization or causing desertification? Well, while costly, there are solutions to salinization and desertification. So we can fix this even though they're pretty bad. These include more efficient irrigation systems, including underground drainage systems, which have to be put in place, stopping crop production for a number of years, and flushing the soils. So using water to take those things like salt away, going ahead and making sure that we have good infrastructure to the soil so that when water comes through, it doesn't take all the topsoil away, these types of things. Unfortunately for farmers, they can't control the weather or other external factors, floods, these types of things. So they have to be prepared for whatever nature throws at them. And unfortunately, the industrialized agricultural system is not set up to deal with these natural disasters. However, agroecology, agroforestry is much better prepared and much more likely to survive, not guaranteed, but much more likely to survive these environmental catastrophes. So people can reduce population, overgrazing, deforestation, and destructive farming practices, as well as reducing the human impact on climate change. And so there are steps that we can take. Now, I want to talk a little bit about another technique that's being used to help us to farm in areas where maybe agriculture struggles, or to go ahead and produce different crops that wouldn't likely have grown in a particular area historically. And that is through genetic modification. Now, for centuries, farmers and scientists have been using crossbreeding to produce new varieties of food. Traditional crossbreeding, however, is a very slow process, and it can take 15 or more years to produce a commercially valuable new crop. But we already eat some of these. I mean, if you have corn, yellow corn is not something that really exists in nature. Right? Corn was multicolored, tended to be smaller grains. Even before it was corn or maize, it was originally a plant called teosinte that was found in the Central American valleys and coastline. Okay. Today, however, we're going through a second gene revolution. It's not about crossbreeding and selective breeding. It's about actually getting in and altering the genes. So scientists and engineers are now using gene splicing to add, delete, or change segments of an organism's DNA. And so while we have historically used lots of genetically modified plants and animals, we are modifying on a level that has not really been seen before. And with the advent of CRISPR-Cas9, this may become even easier, and you may see even more large-scale genetic modification. And this is where the controversy seems to be rising. And so as part of your activity today, I want you to really think about what is the role of genetically modified organisms in terms of our diet, in terms of the environment. How is this modification helping us? Well, in some cases, it's definitely lowering costs, because we can insert something like, I think we talked briefly about this before, the new leaf potato, where they inserted a gene for a soil bacterium's toxin, and it prevents the major pest for the potato from eating the potato, which is a pretty great thing. But people were really bothered by the fact that that little tiny protein, which made up less than 1% of the actual mass of the potato, was there. The USDA decided that it was not a high enough amount in the potato to need it to be labeled. And so people had been eating it at McDonald's. Okay? It was in the French fries. So people had been consuming this new leaf potato that had this new protein that was never there before, and they never even knew it. So what is your right as a consumer to go ahead and get information related to genetic modification? And does it matter? You can see here on the right, there are only 10 GMO crops approved by the USDA to be grown in the United States. There are others that are there as well. It's not quite as straightforward and cut like that, but here are ones that are definitely allowed to be used in terms of GMO. Corn. If you eat corn, it's almost guaranteed to be GMO corn. If you have cotton, okay, cotton, when you wear your clothes, most of you are probably wearing GMO cotton right now. The papaya is an interesting one because we almost lost the papaya completely, but they were able to create a genetically modified version of the papaya to combat something called PRV, or papaya ring virus. And it was on the threat of extinction, but they inserted a gene and it saved the whole papaya trade. So there are some big questions to kind of answer as you go ahead and go through and look at the impact of genetic modification. And it's more than we're going to go into here, but I do want you to keep that thought in mind. So, all right, let's go ahead and take a look at aquaculture. Now, we talked a little bit about this last class when we were looking at the impact of meat and looked at aquaculture as being something that could potentially provide a lot of our shellfish in particular that we like to go ahead and consume and harvest. Now, it's the practice of raising fish and shellfish for human consumption and is also known as fish farming. This is the fastest growing type of food production. While there are aquaculture sustainability standards set by the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, or ASC, only about 4.6% of global operations are certified sustainable. One of the leading sustainable techniques being investigated is what they call open ocean aquaculture. Okay, so the negative environmental impacts of aquaculture are kind of nuanced. They produce a lot of food in a very small area and don't necessarily have a huge impact right away. But nutrient buildup happens in these areas where there's a high density of fish in one area. Fish, even shellfish, produce waste, and their waste has the potential to build up in the surrounding areas. As the waste increases, this can deplete the water of oxygen and create algal blooms and dead zones in the ocean, and we will need to avoid that. But by growing them in the ocean rather than in a farm on land, they are exposed to much more traditional conditions as they would have in terms of harvesting wild examples. So there are pros and cons to this kind of farm fishing. And when you take a look at that number in terms of sustainability, I don't know that that's necessarily a great indicator of how sustainable they are. The process of becoming certified can be quite expensive for some of these operations. And so while some of them may actually be acting very sustainably, they may not get the label sustainable because it's too expensive to go ahead and invest in getting labeled as sustainable, even if they are sustainable. So it's hard to necessarily know exactly whether or not that number represents what's actually sustainable or not. And my feeling is it's probably not. And when we start thinking about the same thing with crops, okay, plants on land, we run into the same sort of problem. A more sustainable food production system would have several different components, but it would require less inputs. Think about what we talked about in terms of agroecology. Compared to our high input farming, low input farming produces similar yields with less energy input and lower greenhouse gas emissions. Low input farms better preserve our topsoil fertility and reduce soil erosion. Because again, I can't overemphasize this enough, we're moving away from monocultures. Monocultures are really hard on the environment. And this is a big reason why GMOs may be one of the few ways to go ahead and save our food production system if we're not able to move to a more agroecology system. If we're going to rely on monocultures where everything is a clone, it's all a copy, you're going to have to change the genes of that plant. Otherwise, nature's going to pick its lock and we're going to have all sorts of viruses and blights and things like that. So what can we do? We can look at more low input farming, right? Diversify, resilience, these types of things. Move towards more organic agriculture. Okay, organics have been really beneficial, and what we've seen is that organic farms are becoming more and more common. It used to be, I remember even 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, you didn't really have organic sections in most markets. You did at places like Whole Foods, maybe Market of Choice, but in more recent years, you're seeing Safeway and Walmart produce much bigger organic sections. More and more people are choosing to go this direction. Less pesticide, right? But this needs people to change the way that they farm. Okay? And so the drive in demand for organic food has led to a change in the composition of the farming industry as more people have shifted over to produce this different food stuff. So polycultures, again, diversity, 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 which leads to resilience. I can't overemphasize that enough. One of the worst things we have done to our agricultural system is invest so heavily in monoculture. But we as consumers are largely responsible for that. Okay? In terms of marketing and things like this, companies, it's easier for them to market, distribute, pack, ship if it's fewer things. And if we only want those few things, then why would they want to do other? But if you have diversity on your plate, they're going to have more diversity in the fields. Okay, so try new foods, right? Try that arugula, or try that bok choy, or try something new. Eat different plants. Don't just rely on the same things over and over and over again, especially those heavily GMO plants like corn. And start trying to move towards more renewable energy sources, because agriculture in general is fairly energy intensive. And so if we want to make that more efficient in terms of the environment, we need to make it more green, which means the energy source that powers it needs to be more renewable. You can make this decision. Use your buying power. If some of you may have watched the Colin the Chicken before, that's entertaining. But it gives you kind of an idea. When you're the one paying the money to buy the food, your money is talking for you. So try and shift to more efficient food sources, especially when it comes to your meat input. If you're going to consume meat continuously, try and move away from beef, pork, carnivorous fish. Go ahead and try substituting poultry or plant-eating farmed fish in their place. Okay? If you can, reduce or eliminate meat. Remember, we talked last class about Meatless Mondays. If all Americans had 1 day a week without meat, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions would be equivalent to taking 30 to 40 million cars off the road for a year. That's pretty big impact. So your food choices, right, or your food print, if we go back to the TED Talk that we watched, can be much different. And if you can get other people on board using grassroots efforts, that can make a real difference in the world. And lastly, more sustainable fish production. But this applies also to other animals and plants. Add labeling to empower consumers. We'll talk about the effectiveness of this and the upsides and downsides. I've already hinted at some of the problems with it when we get to this on Thursday. We look more at things like open ocean aquaculture, raising fish in pens rather than in, fish farms on land. If we do this away from sensitive shorelines, currents will wash away the waste. So hopefully they won't pool up and we won't get these dead zones and the ocean will have time to recover itself. Raise fish and shrimp inland using zero discharge models, ones that aren't going to go ahead and contaminate the land and water around them. But then we have to find a place to go ahead and put those wastes or to refine or clean those wastes so that they can be utilized for, I don't know, fertilizer or something else on the land. Employ polyaquaculture, just like we talked about in terms of polycultures on land. Diversity, diversity, diversity. And then use aquaponics. Fish wastes can fertilize food crops. Do you remember when we were talking about agroecology and we were looking at the duck rice fish case study? Okay, we're using the waste from that fish to fertilize the rice, which is also going ahead and providing the ducks with insects and stuff to go ahead and consume in a water environment, nest in. So there's a whole bunch of interconnectedness, and again, working with nature instead of against it. Okay, guys, take care of yourselves. That's what I got for you today. Stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll talk to you soon. So long.